There are lights that were never meant to be answered. Some shine from places that don't appear on charts, from structures that cast no shadow in daylight, from positions over deep water where nothing has ever been built and nothing could ever stand. And if you have ever worked a coast at night, truly worked it alone in the fog with nothing between you and the Pacific but a railing and a frequency you were hired to maintain, then you know that the worst thing a light can do is respond. Not reflect, not echo. Respond. With a rhythm that isn't yours. With a patience that no machine possesses. With the steady, deliberate insistence of something that has been waiting for you to look, and now that you have, will never stop looking back. I have been trying to write this down for 2 years. Not because I don't remember I remember too well. Every detail, every timestamp, every shift in the air. That's the problem. I remember it the way you remember a conversation that changed your life. Not the words exactly, but the weight of them. The way the room felt different after. The way you kept turning back to it in the dark months later, trying to locate the precise moment when you stopped being the person you were before and became the person you are now. I've started this account 11 times. I've written pages and crossed them out and started again, because the language keeps failing. Not because what happened is indescribable, but because describing it accurately sounds impossible, and describing it vaguely feels like a betrayal of the thing itself. So I'll be precise. I'll use the language I was trained to use. I'll give you the dates and the bearings and the timestamps and the weather conditions, and I'll let you decide what they add up to, because I already know. And knowing is the reason I can't sleep. My name is Ellen Morrow. For 4 years, I was the keeper of Hartshorn Light, a coastal lighthouse on a basalt headland 11 miles north of Calder Cove, Oregon. It is a federal heritage station maintained under the Coastal AIDS Preservation Office, which is a small branch of a larger agency that most people have never heard of, and that exists primarily to ensure that certain historical navigational structures remain operational long past the point of practical necessity. There are 14 such stations on the Oregon coast alone. Most are automated entirely. A few Hartshorn among them retain a live keeper, partly for maintenance, partly for monitoring, and partly, I think, because someone in the agency understood that certain buildings shouldn't be left alone. That some structures accumulate something in their walls over decades of continuous operation, something that isn't sentience exactly but isn't absence either, and that a human presence serves as a kind of ballast, a counterweight, a witness. The lighthouse was established in 1891, built to serve a stretch of coast that had already claimed 9 vessels in the preceding decade. The original wooden tower burned in 1903. A kerosene accident during a November storm, according to the incident report, though the details are sparse, and the report itself has the careful, understated quality of a document written by someone who wasn't present and didn't want to speculate about what they hadn't seen. The current structure, a 46-foot concrete tower with an attached 2-story keeper's quarters, was completed in 1907 and has been in continuous operation in one form or another ever since. 118 years, longer than most marriages, most careers, most towns. The tower has outlasted every person who ever tended it. It will outlast me. When I say keeper, I don't mean the old romantic image. I didn't trim wicks or polish brass by candlelight. There is no oil lamp, no clockwork mechanism, no winding of weights at midnight while the storm rages outside. The modern light is a VRB25 rotating beacon, solar-assisted, with an automated flash sequence, 1 flash every 10 seconds, visible for 16 nautical miles in clear weather. The fog signal is electric, a flat gray disc mounted on the north face of the tower about 4 feet across that produces a low, resonant blast every 30 seconds during reduced visibility. The station's primary power comes from a diesel generator with a propane backup, housed in a concrete outbuilding about 30 yards south of the tower that I called the shed, and that official documents called the auxiliary power and equipment structure. There's also a 30-year-old solar array on the south-facing roof of that shed, a set of 8 panels that contributed about 11% of the daily electrical load during the long summer days, and almost nothing from November through February, when the clouds settled onto the headland like a hand pressing down and didn't lift for weeks. I checked the panel connections quarterly, wiping salt residue from the terminals with a dry cloth, and once, in January of my second year, I found a banana slug making its way across the surface of panel number 3 with a slowness that seemed philosophical. I let it finish its crossing before I cleaned. My job was maintenance, observation, and documentation. 3 words that sound simple and that contained my entire life for 4 years. I cleaned the lens every 3 days. The VRB25 optic is acrylic, a modern unit, nothing like the old 4th order Fresnel that Hartshorn originally used. That lens is in a maritime museum in Astoria now, behind velvet ropes, and I visited it twice, standing in front of it with the strange, dislocated feeling of meeting a relative I never knew, but whose features I recognize in my own face. The Fresnel is beautiful hand-ground glass prisms arranged in concentric rings, designed to take a single flame and bend it into a beam that could reach the horizon. The VRB25 is functional, efficient, and utterly without romance. But it still collected salt residue, moisture haze, and the fine organic film that coastal air deposits on every exposed surface within hours. I wiped it with lint-free cloths and a solution that smelled faintly of rubbing alcohol and something sweeter. I never identified a proprietary formula. The coastal aids office shipped in quarterly, the same solution they'd apparently been using since at least the 80s, judging by the faded, discolored labels on the older bottles I found in the back of the supply closet during my first inventory. The motion was always the same. Top to bottom, clockwise, slow passes with even pressure, the cloth darkening slightly with each stroke. There was something meditative about it. The same motion repeated in the same silence, the lens coming clear beneath my hands like a thought slowly becoming legible. On cleaning days, the lantern room smelled like that solution for hours afterward, and I came to associate the smell with clarity, with the satisfaction of making something see better. I logged weather at 6-hour intervals, 600, 1200, 1800, 00, and supplementally whenever conditions changed significantly. Wind speed and direction from the anemometer mounted on the gallery railing, a small cup-type instrument that clicked softly in any breeze above 4 knots. A sound I could hear from inside the watchroom if the windows were closed and the generator was between cycles. On calm days, the cups barely moved, and the silence where the clicking should have been felt strange, like a missing heartbeat. Barometric pressure from the old mercury barometer mounted on the south wall of the watchroom. A beautiful temperamental instrument in a mahogany case with a brass bezel that I tapped gently with 2 fingers before each reading because Thomas Linden's maintenance notes left in a binder on the watchroom shelf said it stuck. He was right. It stuck every time. 2 taps, always 2. Always with the index and middle finger of my right hand. Always gently, the way you'd knock on the door of a room where someone might be sleeping and the needle would shiver and settle with a small, reluctant motion as if it resented being asked to commit to a number. Visibility I estimated by fixed landmarks I'd memorized within my first month. Calder Head to the south, visible at 9 miles. The Briggs Rocks to the west-southwest, visible at 4 in good conditions, invisible at 2 in moderate fog, and completely erased in heavy weather. On the clearest days, and there were perhaps a dozen a year when the air was so washed and transparent that the world looked new, I could see a faint blue suggestion of something on the far northern horizon that Dan Harker told me was Cape Alderson, 40 miles away. I was never entirely sure if I was seeing it or wanting to see it. I logged it either way. I filed monthly condition reports. I performed quarterly inspections of the concrete exterior, walking the full circumference of the tower base with a clipboard, noting cracks, moisture stains, vegetation encroachment, the slow patient work of salt and wind against a structure that was, by the standards of this coast, still young. I inspected the iron gallery railing for corrosion, the lantern room glazing for seal failure, and the foundation drainage system, a network of perforated pipes buried in gravel around the tower base that had partially collapsed on the east side sometime in the 90s, and been repaired with materials that didn't match and wouldn't last. I reported wildlife incidents, mostly birds striking the glass during fall migration. Their small bodies appeared on the gallery walkway in the mornings like mist-delivered mail, each one a different species, a different weight, a different arrangement of feathers and silence. I'd pick them up with gloved hands, note the species if I could identify it. Swainson's thrush, varied thrush, golden-crowned sparrow, and placed them in the grass below the tower where the foxes could find them. Some mornings there were none. Some mornings there were 6 or 8, and on those mornings I moved more slowly through the rest of the day, carrying a weight I couldn't name and didn't try to. It was quiet work. It was supposed to be quiet work. The kind of job you take when you need the world to stop asking things of you for a while, when the weight of being needed by other people has become indistinguishable from the weight of failing them, and you need a place where the only things that depend on you are mechanical, and the only conversations you're expected to maintain are with instruments. I was 41 when I started. My mother had died 7 months earlier, ovarian cancer, diagnosed in January, dead by March. The speed of it like a door slamming in a house you thought was empty. I had been her primary caregiver for those 2 months, driving to her apartment in Salem 3 times a week, sitting with her while the light changed quality in her bedroom window, and the machines beside her bed beeped their small, useless reports, learning the particular silence that fills a room when someone is leaving it by degrees. She weighed 91 pounds at the end. Her hands were transparent. She asked me once, near the very end, whether the light outside was getting brighter or whether that was just her, and I said I didn't know. And she said, "It's probably just me," and closed her eyes, and that was the last full sentence she spoke to me. My marriage had ended the year before that, not dramatically but thoroughly, the way a river changes course over seasons and leaves the old bed dry. There was no single betrayal, no slammed door, no revelation. Just the quiet, exhausted recognition that we had become 2 people living parallel lives in the same house, and that the house was not big enough to disguise it anymore. I had a daughter, Iris. She was 15 that year and living with her father in Eugene, and she called me every Sunday at 4 o'clock with a reliability that I found both comforting and quietly devastating because it meant she'd learned to schedule me, to treat her own mother as an appointment. I answered every call. I tried to be present, but I could hear myself from the outside sometimes, the interested noises, the careful questions, the way I said, "That's great, sweetheart," with a warmth that was genuine but performed, like a musician sight-reading a piece they once knew by heart and finding the notes still there but the feeling gone. Iris deserved better. She deserved a mother who didn't have to try to be there. I didn't know how to be that person anymore. I wasn't sure I'd ever known. I applied for the Hartshorn posting in June 2019. The Coastal AIDS Preservation Office accepted me in August, a phone interview, a background check, a medical clearance form that asked about my vision and my ability to climb stairs and nothing about my state of mind, which was either an oversight or a mercy. I drove out on September 3rd with everything I owned fitting in a rented cargo van and the back seat of my car 2 trips up the gravel switchback road to the station, unloading boxes in a light rain that smelled like pine needles and diesel from the generator house, the air cool and salt-heavy, the sky a uniform gray that seemed not oppressive but protective, like a blanket pulled over the headland. The quarters were small but solid, a kitchen with a gas stove and a window that faced the tree line, where Sitka spruce stood in a dark, patient row like something waiting. A sitting room with a wood stove and built-in bookshelves that still held a few of Linden's Things field guides for coastal birds and marine mammals. A tide table from 1974, a paperback novel with the cover torn off whose first line was, "The sea was the color of bad decisions." A bedroom upstairs with a window that faced the sea, the glass old enough to have a faint waviness to it that made the water outside seem to breathe even on calm days. The mattress was new. The sheets were not. I didn't care. The first thing I did before I unpacked a single box was climb the tower to the lantern room and look out. The gallery wraps the full circumference, a narrow iron walkway with a railing that comes to about hip height. The paint was peeling in long, elegant curls, revealing layers beneath white, over gray, over red, over something darker that might have been the original primer from 1907. I counted 4 layers. 4 keepers worth of paint at least, each one covering what came before without removing it. The concrete was cold and slightly rough under my hand, with a texture like fine sandpaper, and here and there a crystal of quartz caught the light and gave back a small, sharp flash. The wind was steady from the northwest, carrying salt and the deep green smell of open Pacific water, and beneath it something mineral, something that came from the rocks below and the centuries of tide working against them. Below the headland, the sea moved against the basalt with a sound like something heavy being dragged across a stone floor. Not violent, rhythmic, inevitable. The sound of patience applied at geological scale. I stood there for a long time. I could see the curve of the coast to the south, the white thread of surf along the shore, the rooftops of Calder Cove in the distance. And to the west, the dark line of the Briggs Rocks breaking the surface about 4 miles out, their edges fringed with white water. Beyond them, nothing, just the horizon. A clean, featureless line where the water met the sky, so sharp it looked drawn with a ruler. I remember thinking, this is a place where you could disappear into your own silence and never need to come back. I was right about that. I was wrong about what else was listening. The first 3 months were exactly what I needed. September through November, I fell into the rhythm of the station the way you fall into sleep after a long illness, gratefully, completely, without resistance. I woke at 5:30 each morning, not to an alarm but to the light-changing quality through the bedroom window, shifting from black to a deep bruised blue that meant dawn was 40 minutes away. I'd lie there for a few minutes listening to the building. The quarters had their own vocabulary of sounds, the tick of the baseboard heater expanding as the thermostat kicked in, the faint hum of the refrigerator compressor cycling on, the creak of the roof beams adjusting to the temperature differential between the heated interior and the cold morning air, and the wind, always the wind, finding gaps in the window frames and producing a thin, nearly subsonic whistle that I could feel more than hear, a vibration in the bones behind my ears that became, over weeks, as familiar as my own breathing. Coffee first, always. I kept a stovetop percolator on the gas range, the old-fashioned kind with the glass knob on top and a handle that got too hot, unless you wrapped it with a dish towel, which I did. The same towel, the same fold, every morning. I'd stand in the kitchen watching the percolator work while the first gray light came through the window. The flame was blue and steady, barely visible in the growing daylight. The percolator made a sound like a slow, patient heartbeat, thup, 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 and the coffee rose into the glass knob in dark surges, and the kitchen filled with a smell that was the closest thing I had to a morning prayer. The coffee itself was never good. I bought whatever was cheapest at Decker's General in Calder Cove during my Thursday supply, runs a brand in a red can that tasted vaguely of cardboard and necessity. But the ritual of it mattered more than the quality. The smell filling the small room, the warmth of the mug against my palms, both hands, always both hands, wrapped around the ceramic with my fingers interlaced. The way the first sip burned the roof of my mouth slightly, and I let it every morning, a small, reliable pain that meant the day had started, and I was in it. After coffee, the first weather log. I'd pull on my jacket, the same green field jacket every morning, hung on the same hook by the kitchen door, smelling permanently of salt and wood smoke and the faintly chemical residue of the lens cleaning solution, and climb the tower stairs. 63 steps, iron, with a slight wobble on the 38th that I learned to anticipate the way you learn the bad stair in a childhood home. My footsteps rang on the metal in a pattern I could have identified in my sleep. Solid, solid, solid. Wobble. Solid. The sound echoed in the tower shaft, bouncing off the curved concrete walls, rising ahead of me like an announcement. By the time I reached the watchroom, I'd already begun the day's first assessment without thinking about it. The quality of the light through the narrow slit windows, the pitch of the wind against the tower's skin, the feeling of the air pressure in my inner ears before I ever looked at the barometer. 2 taps, needle shiver, reading noted. Then the anemometer display, wind speed, direction, the numbers steady or flickering depending on the conditions. Then the door to the gallery, heavy, iron-framed, with a rubber seal around the edge that was supposed to be weather-tight but that leaked in driving rain, leaving a small puddle on the watchroom floor that I mopped up with a rag I kept on the hook beside the door. That first look each morning was the closest thing I had to worship. The gallery faces every direction at once. You turn a slow circle and the entire world presents itself, the coast curving south toward Calder Cove, The rocks, the open water stretching to the horizon and beyond, the tree line behind the station dark with spruce and fir, the gravel road winding down through the headland meadow toward the county road below. In clear weather, the light was extraordinary. Not bright exactly, but present, a silvery coastal clarity that made every edge sharp and every color honest. The greens were greener, the grays were more precise. Even the white of the surf had a crispness to it, as if the world had been brought into focus overnight and hadn't yet begun to blur. I'd estimate visibility, note it on the clipboard, and then stand there for an extra minute or two. Sometimes 5, sometimes 10 if the light was good breathing, letting the wind push against my face, letting the sound of the sea fill the space where thought usually lived. Those minutes were not in any manual. They were not part of any procedure. They were mine. Then the lens, if it was a cleaning day. Then the rain gauge, a simple graduated cylinder mounted on a wooden post near the equipment shed, which I emptied each morning into a second cylinder for measurement, recording the total in the logbook, and then pouring the collected water onto the soil beside the shed foundation, where nothing grew except moss, a colony of liverwort, and a single persistent sword fern that I had developed an irrational attachment to, and which I privately called Margaret. I talked to Margaret sometimes, not in words, exactly, more a kind of acknowledgement, a nod, a quiet, still here, as I poured the water around her base. She was the only living thing on the headland that seemed to be thriving rather than enduring, and I admired that. I admired her refusal to care about the wind or the salt or the fact that she had chosen the most inhospitable square foot of soil on the Oregon coast and had decided to make it work. Generator checks were Monday and Thursday mornings. I'd unlock the shed door, a heavy steel door with a padlock that had been changed at some point from the original because the key was newer than everything else, and step into the smell. Diesel, warm metal, the faintly sweet odor of electrical insulation, and underneath it the dense, oily smell of the concrete floor that had absorbed 40 years of fuel deliveries and minor spills. The generator was a squat, green-painted unit about the size of a washing machine, and it ran with a sound that was lower and steadier than any other machine I'd ever been near, a sound you didn't so much hear as inhabit, like standing inside a note that never ended. I checked the oil level with the dipstick pull, wipe, reinsert, pull, read, and the coolant level through the sight glass on the side of the reservoir, and the battery terminals for the white-green fur of corrosion that salt air produced on any exposed metal within weeks. Then the vibration mounts 4 rubber pads between the unit and its concrete base, which I checked by crouching beside the generator and pressing each mount with my thumb, feeling for the particular softness that Lyndon's notes said preceded failure. The mounts deteriorated faster than the maintenance schedule predicted, he'd written, underlining the word faster twice. And he was right. I replaced 2 sets in my first 3 years. Thursdays were town days. I'd drive the gravel switchback down to the county road 12 minutes in dry weather, 20 in rain, the tires crunching on loose stone and the car rocking through the curves with the windows cracked so I could smell the forest on the descent. Douglas fir and wet earth and the sharp green scent of sword fern, Margaret's relatives, living in easier conditions, and sometimes, when the road dipped through a low stretch, the sweet, slightly decayed smell of standing water in the ditch. Then 14 miles south along the coast to Calder Cove, the road hugging the bluffs with the ocean flickering between the trees to my right, appearing and disappearing like a thought I couldn't hold. Calder Cove is a small town not dying exactly, but resting, the way a person rests between efforts, gathering energy for something that may never come. A harbor with a dozen commercial boats and twice that many pleasure craft, their masts rocking in unison with the swell. A grocery store. A hardware store run by a man named Webb who spoke exclusively in short declarative sentences and who knew every fastener in his inventory by touch. A diner called Gill's that occupied a converted bait shop at the harbor's edge, with windows that faced the water and a flat griddle behind the counter that had been seasoned by 40 years of breakfast. And that gave everything cooked on it a faint, not unpleasant taste of accumulated history. And a library in a converted church with pointed windows and a ceiling that still bore the shadows of removed fixtures, that Ruth Egan ran with the quiet ferocity of someone who understood that books were the last honest institutions left, and that her job was not merely to lend them, but to defend them against time and indifference and the county budget office, which she discussed in terms usually reserved for occupying armies. My routine in town was fixed, and the fixedness was the point. Decker's General first, coffee in the red can, canned beans, canned tomatoes, pasta, rice, onions, garlic, whatever fresh vegetables they had, which was unpredictable. Sometimes beautiful heads of broccoli that looked like small green trees, sometimes nothing but a bin of potatoes with eyes growing in every direction. Lamp oil for the hurricane lantern I kept on the kitchen counter as a backup light source. Batteries and bulk D cells for the handheld spotlight, AA for the portable radio. The small square 9 volts for the smoke detectors that I changed every 6 months, whether they needed it or not. The lens cleaning solution, which they special ordered for me and kept behind the counter in a brown paper bag with Morrow written on it in black marker in Mrs. Decker's cramped, precise handwriting. She rang everything up without comment, her fingers moving over the register keys with the automatic precision of someone who had been doing this particular task for longer than I'd been alive. I always paid cash. She always counted the change out loud. Then Gills for a late breakfast. Third stool from the left at the counter, not because I'd chosen it deliberately, but because the first time I sat there it felt right. The angle of the window correct, the distance from the kitchen neither too close nor too far. And after that it became law, in the way that small habits become law when you live alone. Eggs over medium, wheat toast, coffee that Gil made in a machine older than I was, and that tasted nothing like my percolator coffee and everything like the opposite of solitude. The waitress was named Carol, not Coral, though I didn't learn this definitively until my 4th month when I finally read her name tag instead of guessing. She called everyone Hun with a warmth that seemed genuine and unburdened, a kindness that cost her nothing because it came from surplus rather than effort. She refilled my coffee without asking. She never once asked me what I did or why I was always alone, and I appreciated that more than I ever told her, though I suspect she knew. Then the library. Ruth and I had developed an understanding in my first weeks. She pulled books she thought I'd like and left them in a canvas tote behind the circulation desk with my name on a strip of masking tape. I'd return what I'd finished, take what she'd chosen, and we'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes about nothing consequential: the weather, the harbor seals that hauled out on the rocks south of town, and that she could see from the library's south window with her binoculars, her ongoing war with the county over the library's heating system, which she described in terms that made it sound less like a budget dispute and more like a siege, with supply lines and strategic retreats and occasional small victories. She never asked me personal questions. I never offered personal answers. It was the most comfortable friendship I'd had in years, built entirely on the shared understanding that some people are better known by what they don't say. Then home. Back up the switchback, parking beside the shed, carrying grocery bags inside while the wind pulled at my jacket and the generator hummed from behind its concrete walls. Those evenings, I'd cook something simple: pasta with canned tomatoes and whatever herbs were surviving in the small clay pots on the kitchen windowsill, or rice with vegetables sautéed in olive oil with garlic I sliced too thick because the knife was dull, and I kept forgetting to ask Webb about a sharpening stone. I'd eat at the small kitchen table with a book propped open against the salt shaker, reading and eating in the particular silence of a person who has made peace with being the only one in the room, or at least has gotten good enough at pretending that the distinction no longer seems important. After dinner, the evening weather log, another climb, another 2-fingered tap of the barometer, another slow turn on the gallery, the air colder now, the sky deepening from gray to charcoal, to a black so complete that the sea below was visible only as sound and smell, and the faint phosphorescent flash of waves breaking against the headland rocks. The beacon would be running by then, its flash sweeping the headland every 10 seconds, and I'd lean against the railing and feel the light pass over me, a brief warmth on my back and shoulders, like being touched by something large and indifferent. Some evenings I stayed longer than the log required. Some evenings I stayed until my hands were numb on the iron, and the cold had worked through my jacket and into the muscles of my shoulders, and I could feel every one of the 63 stairs in my legs. I slept better at Hartshorn than I had anywhere in 5 years. The isolation didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like rest, like the world had finally stopped talking and was letting me sit in the quiet and remember who I was when no one needed me to be anything else. That changed on the 19th of November. I was in the watchroom at 2:11 in the morning. The Coastal Aids Office didn't require overnight monitoring. The light and fog signal were automated, and the station's systems would alert me via a panel in the quarters if anything failed, a small box of indicator lights and switches mounted beside the bedroom door that I checked each night before bed the way other people checked their locks. But I couldn't sleep. The wind had shifted after midnight, swinging from northwest to due west, and something about the change woke me, not the sound exactly, but the alteration in it. The way the building's familiar creaks and whistles reorganized themselves into a pattern I hadn't memorized yet. The quarters spoke a different language when the wind came from the west. The window frames found new gaps. The stovepipe in the sitting room produced a low, hollow tone, almost musical, almost deliberate. So I got up, wool socks, the ones I kept beside the bed, downstairs, the kitchen, the stove. I made tea chamomile from a box at Decker's with a cartoon bear on it that I found privately embarrassing but that made perfectly adequate tea, which I took as its own form of forgiveness. The kettle took 4 minutes. I stood in the kitchen listening to the building shift around me, the heater ticking, the wind pressing and releasing, and then I poured the water and carried the mug up the tower stairs because that's where I went when I couldn't sleep. It was the highest point, the closest to the sky. And on a clear night, the view from the gallery could make you forget that you'd ever been unhappy. It was not a clear night. The fog had come in from the west, a thick marine layer that turned the beacon's beam into a slow, sweeping cone of diffused white light, each flash illuminating nothing but the moisture in the air. Visibility was under a quarter mile. I couldn't see the water. I couldn't see the rocks. The headland had vanished. The world was the gallery, the glass, the fog, and the sound of the fog signal running its low pulse going out every 30 seconds, a sound that moved through the iron railing and into my hands and through my chest and into my back where I leaned against the lantern room wall, so that each pulse felt less heard than received, a vibration that started outside my body and ended somewhere behind my sternum. Between pulses, the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The tea steamed, the fog moved against the gallery railing in slow visible currents, and moisture collected on the iron and ran down in thin streams and dripped onto the walkway in a rhythm that was almost regular, almost deliberate, like a clock counting something other than seconds. I was standing there looking at nothing, thinking about nothing, and in the particular state of emptied awareness that the small hours produce when the world shrinks to sensation and proximity. When I saw the light, it was faint, a pale yellowish glow in the fog, low on the water, or where the water would have been roughly southwest, not a ship's light. I'd learned to recognize those in my first weeks, the regulated colors, the movement, the way they obeyed the rules of vessels traveling from one known point to another. This obeyed nothing. It was stationary, steady, and it had a quality I don't know how to describe except to say that it looked old. Not dim old, like light that had been traveling a long time to reach me, like light that had started from somewhere very far away and arrived tired but purposeful, carrying information I didn't know how to read. I watched it for approximately 90 seconds. I held my tea with both hands because one wasn't enough to keep them steady. The fog signal pulsed. The light remained. The fog signal pulsed again. Then the fog thickened, a visible increase in density, like a curtain being drawn. And the light was gone. I went inside. I sat in the watchroom and let my heart rate settle and let the rational part of my mind assemble its explanations. A vessel at anchor. Atmospheric refraction. A reflection from the beacon bouncing off a fog layer at an unusual angle. I selected the most reasonable of atmospheric refraction and logged the sighting. November 19th, 2:11 hours. Stationary light observed bearing approximately 247, range indeterminate, duration approximately 90 seconds, fog obscured. Source unknown, dry, factual, institutional. The language of someone trained to observe without interpreting. But I remember sitting there afterward, the logbook closed, the pen set down parallel to its spine, and thinking, That light was looking at me, not shining toward me, looking. The barricade I built from reasonable explanations held for a while. The light came back 4 nights later, same bearing, roughly 246, same quality, duration nearly 3 minutes. Then again 3 nights after that. By December it was appearing 2 or 3 times a week, always in fog, always between midnight and 4, always southwest between 245 and 248 degrees. I began setting an alarm for 1:45 on foggy nights, making tea, climbing the dark stairs in wool socks with the mug warm in my hand, and waiting in the watchroom with the clipboard on my lap. I logged each sighting. Date, time, bearing, duration, conditions. The entries accumulated with a regularity that should have been reassuring. This is how you manage the unknown, by giving it columns and rows, by making it answer to bureaucratic structure. But each entry made the thing feel more established, more real, as if by writing it down I was granting it institutional existence. And once something has institutional existence, it doesn't go away. It becomes part of what the station knows. I began to dread the logging more than the sighting. In January, I mentioned it to Dan Harker. Dan was the closest thing I had to a neighbor, a retired Coast Guard officer in his 60s who lived in a cabin 2 miles south along the headland and walked with a limp from a training accident he never discussed. He kept 3 dogs named Birch, Bracken, and Bly, and he came by the station every couple of weeks to check on me, which I suspected was an informal arrangement with the Coastal AIDS office, but which he always framed as social. We'd drink coffee in my kitchen and talk about weather and marine traffic and the county roads' deterioration. And he'd look around the quarters with the practiced eye of someone evaluating structural integrity while pretending to admire the curtains. I mentioned the light casually. Something in the fog. Stationary. Southwest. He held his mug in both hands and looked out the kitchen window at the spruce, and he didn't react immediately, which I noticed because Dan usually reacted immediately. He was a man of quick assessments. "What bearing?" he said, still looking at the trees. 245 to 248, always in the fog. A long silence. He turned his mug once, slowly, on the table. "There's an old story in Calder Cove about a light offshore, the Goss Light, named after a boat that went down in '51, the Elmira Goss, fishing vessel, ran aground on the Briggs Rocks in heavy fog. 4 crew, all lost. There's a plaque in the harbor." "And before that?" I asked. "Before the wreck, was there a light before?" Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm, but recalibration. The look of a man who'd expected a certain question and gotten a more dangerous one. "I don't know," he said. "I've only heard the Goss version." He changed the subject. We talked about the road. He finished his coffee, called his dogs, and left. After the door closed, I stood in the kitchen holding my empty mug and thinking about the way he'd said, "I don't know." It had sounded true, but careful. Like a door closed gently so you wouldn't notice it was a door. That weekend, I drove to Calder Cove on a Saturday. A schedule violation, Ruth noted immediately. "It's Saturday," she said from behind the circulation desk. "I know. I had a question." I asked about the Elmira Goss. She set down her index card, removed her glasses, looked at me the way she looked at books with water damage. "Sit down," she said. The Elmira Goss was a 42-foot fishing vessel. On March 15, 1951, it left the harbor at approximately 4 a.m. for a routine run. The weather deteriorated fast. Fog came in heavy, not the kind that drifts, but the kind that arrives like a wall collapsing. The vessel struck the Briggs Rocks at approximately 5:40. The wreck was found 2 days later, the hull broken, debris spread over a quarter-mile of shoreline. All 4 crew lost. 3 bodies recovered. The 4th, the captain, Gerald Goss, was never found. The light story started a few months after, Ruth said. Fishermen seeing a glow off the headland, always in fog, always southwest. Most people chalked it up to grief. It persisted. Every few years, new people reported it. Always the same description. And before the wreck, Ruth went to the back of the library, to the local history collection, 2 glass-fronted cases and a filing cabinet she described as the most disorganized repository of primary sources on the Oregon coast. She returned with a manila folder, brittle at the edges, held shut with a rubber band that had partially fossilized. Thomas Linden's keeper log, she said. Hartshorn Light, 67 to 78, 11 years. He gave copies of certain pages to the Historical Society before he died. Selected pages, the ones he wanted someone to have. Inside, photocopies, grainy, slightly crooked, the handwriting small and precise and slanted to the right, the same logbook format I used. March 9th, 1971, 2:17 hours. Light observed bearing approximately 246, range unknown. Steady illumination, pale yellow. Duration 4 minutes. Fog, wind. SW 8 knots, no vessel traffic. March 23rd, 03:04 hours. Light bearing 245, duration 6 minutes. Fog, no traffic. Light appeared responsive to beacon when Hartshorn beam swept through bearing. Light intensified briefly before returning to baseline. Responsive. The word sat on the page with a weight the institutional format couldn't contain. A refraction is not responsive. A reflection is not responsive. Only something paying attention is responsive. August 14th, 1971, the last entry he'd copied. 0131 hours. Light bearing 245 steady. Duration unknown observed intermittently over approximately 2 hours. Fog, calm. I turned off the automated beacon and operated the light manually for 11 minutes, using a deliberate flash sequence, 3 short. Pause, 2 long. The light offshore responded. Not an echo, not a reflection, a response, different pattern. 4 short, pause, 1 long. I repeated my sequence. It repeated its response. This continued for several exchanges. I restored automatic operation at 0340. I am recording this accurately. It is not a vessel. It is not a reflection. It knows my rhythm. Ruth closed the folder. The library was very quiet. 20 years before the Goss went down, I said. Yes, the light predates the wreck. Whatever it is, it was there before there was a tragedy to explain it. And before Linden. Aldrich Voss, keeper from 1923 to 1951, 28 years. The Historical Society has almost nothing from him, but a 1931 Coast Guard inspection report references Voss mentioning unusual light activity offshore. The inspector noted it as atmospheric refraction and didn't follow up. 1931, 20 years before the Elmira Goss. 8 years after Voss arrived. The light had been there for as long as anyone had stood on that gallery and looked southwest. Linden left after 11 years, Ruth said. He requested a transfer to an inland station somewhere in Idaho and never came back to the coast. Never. Whatever he saw or understood, it was enough to make him leave. I understand. Do you? I didn't answer. I checked out 2 novels and drove home in rain that made the gravel road shine like polished stone. I parked beside the shed and sat in the car with the engine off, looking up at the tower, watching the beacon turn its slow circle against low clouds. That night, for the first time, I responded. The fog came in around 10. I felt it before I saw it, pressure shifting, sound softening, the kitchen window going opaque while I washed my dinner plate. I dried my hands, hung the towel on the oven handle, and climbed the stairs. The watchroom was cool, the barometer dropping. I tapped it, stepped onto the gallery. The fog enclosed me like a room with no walls. At 2:07, the light appeared, bearing 245, steady, pale, waiting. I went to the lantern room. The manual override key hung on a brass hook beside the control panel, a key I'd never used. It turned with resistance, decades of salt air in the mechanism. Something clicked. The beacon stopped its automatic sequence and held under my control. I pointed it at bearing 245, 3 short flashes, then 2 long. The same sequence Linden had used in 1971, though I hadn't planned it. My hands chose it. The light offshore dimmed, then responded. 4 short, 1 long. The same answer Linden received. 49 years later. As if it had been waiting with that answer ready for half a century, waiting for someone to ask the question again. I stood in the lantern room with my heart in my throat and flashed a different pattern. 2 long, 1 short, 3 long. Something new. Something mine. The light answered. Not an echo. Not a copy. A new sequence. Something it chose. Something composed in response to what I had said. The way a person continues a sentence they've never heard before. I was crying. Not from fear, though fear was there, and not from grief exactly, though grief was the foundation of everything I'd felt for 2 years. I was crying because something was speaking to me without wanting anything from me. Not my competence, not my recovery, not my forgiveness, not my strength, just my attention, just my rhythm. Just the specific pattern of who I was, transmitted across dark water to something that recognized it because it was transmitting the same pattern back. We spoke for 43 minutes. The exchanges grew fluid. I varied intervals and it varied differently, not copying but conversing. I introduced a long silence in the middle of a sequence, a held darkness, and the light answered with its own held darkness, and for a moment we were both not shining. And the shared silence was the most intimate thing I had ever experienced. At 2:52, the fog thinned. The light faded the way a voice fades when someone turns a corner and keeps talking, and the words become sounds, and the sounds become silence, and the silence becomes a kind of presence. I restored automatic operation, logged everything, went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with tea that went cold while I stared at the window and tried to understand whether I had crossed a line. I couldn't see the kind you feel the way you feel the edge of a cliff in darkness. Not by seeing the drop, by the way the air changes, by the way the ground beneath your feet becomes a question. I continued the exchanges through winter and into spring. Not every night the light appeared only in fog, but when conditions were right, I climbed the tower, switched to manual, and we spoke. I kept a separate composition book, black cover, in the nightstand drawer. Patterns grew complex. Early conversations were simple call and response. But by February, the light was initiating sequences I hadn't used. Longer pauses, rhythmic clusters, gradations of intensity that weren't binary. Bright and less bright and barely there and then blazing, like emphasis, like inflection, like the difference between saying something and meaning it. I was learning a language, or being taught one. By March, the distinction had ceased to matter. During the days, I held on to routine with the deliberate care of someone who understood it was the architecture of sanity. Lens cleaning, gallery walks, rain gauge, Margaret, generator checks, weather logs. The percolator every morning, the barometer tap, the clipboard on its nail. Thursday trips to Calder Cove, Deckers, Gills, the library, third stool, eggs and toast, Carol calling me hun, Ruth looking at me over her reading glasses with increasing concern. "You're sleeping less," Ruth said in late January. "The barometer's been unstable." She accepted the deflection with a silence that made clear she knew it was one. She set 2 books in the tote. One was a history of lighthouse engineering. The other was poetry. I read the poems first. They were about water and distance and the things we say to the dark. I don't know if Ruth chose them deliberately. I suspect she did. In March, something changed. The fog that night was the heaviest since November. Visibility 0. The fog signal ran at full strength, each pulse a physical force in the floor. I stood in the lantern room with the override engaged. Beam aimed at 245. The light appeared at 207. I flashed my greeting 4 short. Pause. 1 long adopted from its original answer to Lyndon. Now my hello. It answered. Then it did something new. A long, sustained pulsing, intensity rising and falling in waves, like breathing. It lasted 3 minutes. I didn't respond. I understood this wasn't a prompt. It was showing me something. When the pulsing stopped, the light snapped to a new intensity, hard, clear, cutting through the fog with what felt like intention. And for the first time, I could see something within the glow. A shape, vertical, dark against the illumination. A tower. I pressed my face to the glass. The fog was thick, but the light was burning through it, and I could see the outline of a fixed structure on the water. Not a vessel, a tower, on a foundation or reef or something solid, rising from the open Pacific where charts showed nothing but 700 feet of depth. No shoals, no rocks, no bottom features, and on the gallery of that tower a figure. Standing, facing me, small with distance but unmistakable, a person on a narrow walkway looking toward Hartshorn Light the way I was looking toward them. I raised my hand. Not a professional gesture, not protocol. I raised my palm and held it against the glass. The figure raised a hand in return. The fog closed. The tower. The figure. The hand consumed by gray, ordinary marine air. The beacon resumed automatic rotation, sweeping through empty fog, illuminating nothing. I stood in the lantern room until my legs ached and my hand was still on the glass. Condensation from my breath had formed a halo around my palm print. I watched it dissolve back into clarity. I did not log this officially. In my notebook at 3:30 in the kitchen, with tea going cold and handwriting so unsteady I could barely read it, I wrote what I saw. And then I wrote, "It wasn't showing me something new. It was showing me what has always been there." After that night, I knew the logbook and the notebook and the timestamps couldn't hold what was happening. I was not making a scientific record. I was corresponding. And the correspondence was between two keepers. Two people on galleries across an impossible distance, learning each other's rhythms, closing a gap that shouldn't exist. I thought about Lyndon, his 11 years, and then his quiet transfer inland, his refusal to return. Ruth had framed it as warning. The more I turned it over, the more it seemed like grief. He'd been speaking with the light long enough to write, "It knows my rhythm." And then he'd stopped. What had that cost him? What had it cost the light? I called Iris on a Sunday in April. She told me about school, a friend, a documentary about octopuses. I listened and asked the right questions, and at the end she said, "Mom, are you okay? You sound far away." "I'm always far away," I said, meaning it as a joke, and it landed wrong. And the silence that followed had a texture dense, slightly wounded, and I spent that evening on the bench outside the shed, watching the last light drain from the sky, thinking about the ways we fail people not through cruelty but through slow reorientation, turning degree by degree towards something that isn't them until they're behind us, and the thing we're facing has consumed the horizon. I filed my resignation on April 18th. 30 days notice. Personal reasons. Simple paperwork. The office didn't ask questions. Keepers left. It was expected. I spent the last month at Hartshorn with the careful attention of someone saying goodbye to a place that had changed them permanently. I cleaned the lens a final time, slowly, methodically, already mourning the motion. I walked the gallery every morning and evening. I emptied the rain gauge and spoke to Margaret. I tapped the barometer. I logged the weather. Each entry felt like the last line of a letter I was writing to the station itself. I drove to Calder Cove on my last Thursday. Deckers, gills, third stool, eggs, toast. Carol calling me hon one more time. The library. Ruth looked at me over her glasses. "You're leaving?" "Yes." She reached under the desk and handed me a small envelope. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, slightly yellowed, curled at the corners. Hartshorn Light from the water, taken from a boat, the tower against gray sky. And in the foreground, low, to the left, a smear of light on the water's surface. It could have been reflection. It could have been a flaw in the film. 1938, Voss was keeper. The smear was in the right position, southwest, bearing 245. "Thank you, Ruth. Be well, Ellen." On the last night I climbed the tower. It was clear, no fog, no overcast, just black sky dense with stars and a moon that laid a silver road across the water. I stood on the gallery and looked southwest. The horizon was sharp and empty. The Briggs rocks were dark shapes in moonlight. No glow, no light, just the ocean, breathing. "I have to go," I said out loud. "To the dark, to the water, to whatever stood on a gallery I couldn't see. I don't know if I'll come back. I'm sorry." The beacon turned. Flash. Dark. Flash. Dark. The sea said nothing. The fog stayed away. I climbed down the 63 steps, the 38th wobbling under my foot, and closed the door and locked it, and slid the key through the mail slot and stood in the dark with my forehead against the wood and my hand flat on the surface and breathed. I moved to Bend, inland, as far from the coast as possible without leaving the state. A small house on a quiet street lined with juniper. A job at the county library, not Ruth's, not a lighthouse, but a place with books and silence. I called Iris every Sunday at 4. She said I sounded closer. I didn't talk about Hartshorn. The notebook went in the nightstand drawer. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. Every sequence lived in me the way music lives in a musician who has stopped playing but hasn't stopped hearing. I watered kitchen plants instead of emptying a rain gauge. I checked the weather app each morning instead of tapping a barometer. I cleaned the library's glass display cases with the same slow clockwise motion, and sometimes, when light came through the windows at a certain angle, I'd stop and hold the cloth and see nothing but my own reflection standing in a room that wasn't a tower, above ground that wasn't the sea. For 2 years I was fine, or I performed fineness so consistently the difference stopped mattering. I maintained systems, I kept routines. I logged the days in the quiet, automatic way of someone who has learned that if you keep doing the small things, the large things lose their power to destroy you. And then, on a night in October, the fog came to the valley. It happens in Bend, not often. Cold air settling in the river canyon, moisture condensing, and by morning the town wrapped in a gray, soft silence that erases the mountains and the trees and the edges of every building and leaves you standing in a world without horizons, without distance, without the architecture of a way. I woke at 1:47 a.m. I don't know what woke me. Not a sound, not a dream, a shift. Something in the quality of the silence, the pressure against the windows, the way the house felt smaller, as if the walls had contracted while I slept. I knew before I opened my eyes. I got up, went to the kitchen, didn't turn on the light, stood at the window. The fog was thick and white and still, pressing against the glass the way it pressed against the lantern room windows at Hartshorn, and the juniper trees were gone, and the street was gone, and the mountains were gone, and there was nothing in the world but me and the window and the fog and the particular terrible intimacy of being enclosed by something that knows exactly where you are. And then I saw it. A light. In the fog. Low, steady, pale, and old. Through the kitchen window of my landlocked house, 93 miles from the nearest coastline, in a high desert valley surrounded by pine and lava rock, and absolutely no body of water deep enough to hide what I knew was out there. The light pulsed. Once. Twice. A rhythm I recognized the way I recognized my own name. 4 short. Pause. 1 long. Hello? I stood at the window for a very long time. The light waited. It had always been patient. It had been patient for Voss, for Linden, for every keeper who ever stood at that gallery and looked southwest and hesitated before answering. It could wait for me. It had been waiting since before I was born. It would wait after I was gone. That is the nature of what it is, not a ghost, not a memory, not a phenomenon, but a keeper, standing on a gallery over dark water, maintaining a light that no one ordered and no one can extinguish, answering every signal that reaches it across the fog, because that is what keepers do. And the conversation it offers is the only one that has ever truly known my rhythm. And I am standing in my kitchen at 1:47 in the morning with my hands at my sides, and the fog is against the glass, and the flashlight is in the drawer, and my hands remember. I tell myself I won't answer. Every night I tell myself that. But the fog is in the valley again tonight, and I can feel it against the windows, patient and heavy, and somewhere in the kitchen drawer there is a flashlight that still works. And my hands remember the patterns the way a heart remembers how to beat. Not by decision, but by design. There is a light out there that knows my rhythm. It has known it longer than I've been alive. It knew Linden's rhythm and Voss's rhythm, and the rhythm of every keeper who ever stood on that gallery and looked southwest and saw something that shouldn't have been there and answered it anyway. Because that's what keepers do. We answer. We maintain the light. We stand in the high, cold, lonely place, and when something calls to us from the dark, we call back, because the alternative is silence, and silence on the water means someone is lost. I haven't answered yet. I want you to know that. I'm standing in my kitchen in Bend, Oregon, 93 miles from the coast, and the fog is pressing against the window, and the light is there. It's there right now. I can see it, steady and patient and old, and I haven't answered. Almost.